In the early days of the franchise, the God of War games used Greek mythology to build their world. That changed with God of War for PS4. I know, it's a GameStop box, it was a gift, don't unsubscribe. God of War for PS4 tells a tale of Kratos and and Atreus, and switches to Norse mythology as a basis. So how does the game's music contribute to this new lore source? Well, I'm gonna tell you. Unless you click away, in which case, bye. I only put a bunch of hours of research into this.
Not to start this with a big long quote, but I'm going to start this with a big long quote because it's really helpful. In an article on God of War on his official website, the game's composer, Bear McCreary, writes, "My first step was to see how far into the realm of Nordic folk music I could push the score. I stripped the ensemble down to a handful of players, a string quartet, a few percussionists, a woodwind player, and an ethnic ensemble of specialty instruments drawn from Nordic folk music, including nyckelharpa, hardanger fiddle, and hurdy-gurdy. I knew I would retain the Nordic folk instrumentation and the spirit of the small, scratchy folk ensemble, but I would also incorporate a massive orchestra, choir, and percussion ensemble. So while the score does have these big, bombastic moments, the core of it comes from the spirit of small, intimate Nordic folk music. Here, I'd like to give a brief overview of the instruments he mentioned: nyckelharpa, hurdy-gurdy, and hardanger fiddle, along with the viola da gamba, which he also uses, and discuss their use in the score and also how they influence even the music they are not directly involved in. Both the hurdy-gurdy and nyckelharpa can be traced back to the very old, very big instrument, the organistrum. Pretty sure that's how you say it. One side of the organistrum had a bunch of keys on it to change pitches, and the other side had a wheel that needed to be cranked to rub against the strings to get the sound going. This big boy was so large that it was often played by two musicians, one on each side. It had 3 strings. Only one was used to play melodies. The other 2 strings were drone strings, which would drone a pitch that the melody could be played over. That drone concept is really important moving forward. The hurdy-gurdy is basically a compact organistrum, more resemblant of the modern-day violin. It's pretty much played the same way: crank a wheel to rub against the strings on one side, hit keys to change pitches on the other. But it's small enough that one person can play the whole thing comfortably. The number of strings varies, but most modern hurdy-gurdys have 2 melody strings and 4 drone strings. The nyckelharpa forgoes the wheel, instead using a bow. The modern nyckelharpa has 16 strings, 3 melody strings, 1 drone string, and 12 strings that are just there to help the instrument resonate. Earlier forms of the nyckelharpa had fewer strings, fewer or no sympathetic strings, and fewer melody strings, but often made use of drone strings. So even though there are way more melodic capabilities on the modern instrument, droning is still a big part of its identity because it was so heavily emphasized in previous models. While we can compare the hurdy-gurdy and nyckelharpa to the old organistrum, the best comparison for the hardanger fiddle is actually the modern-day violin. The differences are that the hardanger fiddle is not really played with vibrato, or slight pitch variation caused by shaking the strings, like a violin is, and it has resonant strings like the nyckelharpa. The bridge of the fiddle is also straight, which changes the tone a bit from that of the violin, with its not-so-straight bridge. The viola da gamba is also easily comparable to a modern orchestral instrument, this time the cello. Picture a cello but with frets, like a guitar has. It has a bit of a gentler sound than the cello, and is used heavily to represent the character Freya. You can hear this instrumentation throughout the God of War soundtrack, along with other instruments imitating this droning, straightforward style. Let's take a quick listen to the beginning of the track Ashes. Note the instrument sound in the drone, but also pay attention to the singers. You can hear the singers droning. Since the drone instruments were so essential to the beginnings of Nordic music, when trying to capture that style, no matter the instrument, droning is often employed. Speaking of those singers, the human voice can be considered an instrument too, so let's chat about them for a bit. The God of War team hired the Icelandic choral ensemble Scala Cantorum to record singing for the game. McCreary explains, "I wanted the voices to evoke Norse mythology, and so we set all of our texts in Old Norse. And the reality is that the modern Icelandic language is the closest language spoken today to Old Norse." Let's talk a bit more about how McCreary uses other instruments to imitate these old string instruments we've talked about. Actually, before we get to McCreary, let's talk about another composer, Niels Gade. Gade was a 19th century composer who wrote symphonies that critics described as having Nordic music characteristics. Gade's first symphony was based on a song that he wrote that itself was based on Nordic folk music. Critics wrote that the Nordic tone they heard in Gade's first symphony came from the way Gade used the orchestra, noting specifically that the brass instruments, combined with arpeggio figures, reminded them of bards striking their harps before battle. An arpeggio is basically when you take a chord and you break the notes up so they don't all play at the same time. Sometimes with quick non-chord tones tossed in. Kind of like what would happen when you strum the strings of a harp. Let's listen to a bit of that in Gade's first symphony. And here is a bit of the same from the God of War soundtrack. Critics also commented on a Nordic tone coming from the overall theatrical approach to Gade's orchestral writing, reflecting the epic nature of Nordic tales. We've definitely got that covered in the God of War soundtrack. You can also hear drones in this symphony, harkening back to those old instruments we were discussing before. There's actually a lot more to these drones than I've talked about so far when it comes to making a Nordic sound. Hope you're not tired of me droning on about drones yet, because I'm about to say drone so many times you'll go into your closet and break your drone. In the book The Nature of Nordic Music, authors, I'm so sorry, I'm going to mispronounce something here, Juha Torvinen and Susanna Välimäki present their findings on pedal points and static textures. Pedal points are basically long, sustained notes, and on top of them, or underneath them, some harmonies go with it nicely and some clash with it, but that pedal point just keeps on sustaining. Here's an example. Listen for that super high note. Basically, it's a fancy drone. Static textures are repetitive musical gestures that don't change much at all. which can include the arpeggios we just talked about before, along with pedal points and drones. These authors found many instances of these in the works of Nordic Council Music Prize-winning pieces of music, which includes the excerpt we just listened to, further defining these characteristics as characteristics of Nordic-sounding music. But why? I said before these drones weren't only about imitating those old instruments, so what else do they provide to the Nordic soundscape? Well, those previously mentioned authors dive into this pretty deeply, pointing out that throughout music history, stasis has been used to provide ambiance and portray environments and natural forces, while more active musical moments within that could portray a protagonist. The author grimly goes even further. In his book, Grieg, Music, Landscape, and Norwegian Identity, he claims, because pedal points are both harmonious and clashy with the surrounding music, that they have a clear nostalgic character, longing for a lost or non-existent home. If you know the plot of God of War at all, you know how fitting that description of pedal points is for our protagonists, and even antagonists. The clearest example is the mission Kratos and Atreus embark on. Faye, Atreus' mother and Kratos' wife, has died, and their ultimate goal is closure through fulfilling her final wish, to have her ashes scattered on the highest mountain. On the way is a ton of conflict, both physical and emotional, with Faye's presence ever looming in the form of Kratos and Atreus' developing father-son relationship. How appropriate, then, is it that the track Ashes features some of the most prominent pedal points in the entire soundtrack? There are also plenty of other very static textures throughout the soundtrack, but sticking with Faye, her main track, Memories of Mother, features a ton. The player is likely to hear such stasis as intended in other Nordic-sounding music, not only as the musical portrayal of physical environments, but also as the looming presence of Faye and the characters striving towards closure. Though it's not just stasis we hear in those tracks. Faye has a melodic theme, and that brings us to our next topic, how melodic material in the God of War soundtrack brings a Nordic feel. Many of the melody's Nordicness actually comes from their simplicity. There are many different Nordic song styles, but a great many of them come from folk song tradition. A folk song is a song from a particular culture that's often passed down from generation to generation by oral tradition. To have folk songs survive for as long as they do, they need to be simple enough that one generation could learn them, memorize them, and pass them down, and have that next generation do the same. Folk songs encapsulate a culture in musical form. If you're American like me, one of our folk songs is This Land Is Your Land, a song all about how all of America belongs to all of its people. 'Cause, freedom and stuff.
This land is your land, and this land is my land, from the California to the New York Island.
As composer Edvard Grieg once said, the music of every country starts with folk songs. So, to get that authenticity, McCreary checked out Nordic folk songs. Nordic folk singers often added their own embellishments to simple folk melodies, and one of the primary recording artists for the God of War soundtrack, Eivor, adds these quite gracefully. Here is what McCreary had written for the track Memories of Mother, and here's the recording. You can hear how she adds in a little spice, which is in line with the tradition. Nordic folk songs are simple like other folk songs. The runo song, a style of Nordic folk song, is characterized by a few tones that form the basis of melodic formulas. These rarely have more than 5 notes. And similarly, many of the main themes of God of War have around 5 notes. Now you may have noticed that I circled some notes there. Those put us above the 5-note standard I was talking about, but I'll come back to those in the upcoming section. You'll see, I promise. After McCreary listened to those Nordic folk songs, he noticed a pattern. He stated, "I was looking for sad lyrical laments, but I always found a hopefulness in the way the Nords used certain chords." And that's actually spot on. I checked out a ton of Nordic music while preparing this video, and there are so many moments of despair and grief being transformed into something triumphant and honestly sublime. The research on Nordic music I read also pointed out this pattern numerous times. Here are a few quotes that stood out to me that really helped me understand the Nordic musical mindset. In Norwegian melodies, an idyllic cheerfulness prevails along with a feature of melancholy, which is common in all Nordic songs. Much of the folk music of Norway is in a minor mode, but never does it give the impression of a depressed people. The dark, misty tone vividly resembles the Nordic legends and ballads. Remember the circled notes I mentioned before? Let's go back and look at them in more detail. In the mother theme, you can tell which tones are non-chord tones, or tones that just kind of happen but aren't essential to the harmonic idea, because McCreary kindly labeled the chords above the notes. I've marked all of the non-chord tones with their non-chord tone types, if you're a music theory geek, but if not, just know that these notes don't really count because they're not contributing to the overall chord, and they come and go quickly. So with those gone, we're left with 6 tones. But C sharp is there to bring us out of that dark, melancholy feeling into something light and triumphant. In fact, this theme is actually written in the D-Dorian mode, with modal writing being common in Nordic folk music, and C sharp is the only note foreign to that mode. So that leaves us with one note that is really essential for the harmonic and modal change from dark to light, and 5 others, kind of like the runo songs we were talking about before. Now, I'm not trying to say that if a melody has a few notes more or less than 5, that it's not authentically Nordic. It's not a hard and fast rule that way. But I do find it very interesting how you can boil down McCreary's melodic formula this way in this very important theme. Here are a few more of the themes. Here in the Witch of the Woods theme, you can hear the transition from dark to light around when we hit the B-flat major chord. Notice that the note D becomes natural there, while it was flat everywhere else. Here in the Magnian Modi theme, we are mainly in the key of E minor, but this G sharp brings us to E major, the parallel major key to E minor. And let's end with the God of War theme. A few times in the God of War track, you get magnificent changes from the C minor key to something truly magnificent and triumphant, like here. There is a great deal of epic and inspiring music out there, but music and culture are intrinsically linked. Bear McCreary and the whole God of War team went the extra mile in ensuring quality through deep immersion in old Nordic life, and that extra care helped imprint God of War as one of the most renowned games of all time.
I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the God of War music. Please do like, subscribe, and all that stuff. Maybe one day I'll make enough money off YouTube that I can get a real box. But until then, I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.